And probably releasing at the fastest every 2 weeks, but more like once a month, sometimes even longer than that. So they weren't releasing or deploying their code very quickly. And there was a lot of resistance to Agile in the office. There was probably only 1 or 2 teams that were actually implementing it, and the others were like kind of dragging their feet, and they were like, we don't know about all this. And almost nobody was doing unit testing, and all the builds were manual. So pretty much any time that someone wanted to release code, it was like this whole process. It wasn't like we just dropped the WAR file and we're done, right? It wasn't like one click. It was like, let's go through like first like a week of regression, and then we're gonna like build the code, and like just kind of a long thing. Even once we were ready to deploy, it might take 2 days. So that's kind of where we started out. So the strategy for success to going from that to like full continuous integration, right, in some cases, in some of the teams in our office, you really need to identify your support team and develop a proof of concept. Like, we wouldn't have gotten any buy-in if we didn't have something that we could show other teams and go, hey, look how awesome this is. And then using a team of leaders that wasn't just QA or wasn't just developers or wasn't just kind of management, business analyst type folks, but using kind of all the leaders in your organization to like model good behavior. And finally, like taking single successes and implementing them department-wide is like a best practice. So first off, like support team, a lot of times if you have a smart idea in your office, you might be the only one who thinks it's a smart idea. So I have a picture here of all these, comic book superheroes, and it's really because you don't want a bunch of people on your team that think exactly like you. You really need a diverse crowd because everyone's going to bring a different perspective on things. Number one, you have to have management support. If you have a smart idea and there isn't someone in your management team who thinks it's also a good idea, you're probably not going to get super far. Because at some point, someone's going to have to put a little pressure and go like, hey, why you guys don't try this new idea? And if you don't have that person, it can be a lot slower going. You can still have results, but it'll take you longer to get people to adopt things. Second thing, you want to start with people from your peer community. So when I got the idea of like, hey, let's make this more awesome and automate, I first went to other testers and say, hey, what do you guys think about automation? Some people were like excited about it, and other people were like, I do manual QA. I don't even know how to write a script. Like, no, right? A lot of resistance there to like, I don't have the skills. I'm afraid if we move this way, like, is it going to be more work? A lot of that. So you kind of have to start with, feeling out the space, and for people who are excited, help them get involved, and for people who aren't excited, find out why not. And then finally, when you reach outside your peer community, look for leaders, and instead of saying, I really want you to help me with my idea, say, hey, what problems are you struggling with around this thing that I'm working on? So, I went to developers and I said, I know you hate that when you finish your code, it's a week and a half before regression is done, and you're waiting, right? Like, they don't put you on the new cool project, you're waiting for me to be finished for like a week. So what can I do to help that not take so long? And then suddenly developers were interested in how they could help me implement test automation, right? Or when I went to a Scrum Master and said, I would love it if at the end of every sprint you guys could release. And they were like, that sounds cool. Like, how does that happen? Oh, well, there's these couple of things I need help with you guys to get the developers on board or get management on board for these 2 little tweaks that would allow that to happen. So getting a support team, it's not necessarily easy, but by having the right approach, you can get a lot of people excited and allow them to see like what's possible versus we're kind of mired in this current infrastructure. So getting permission, depending on the type of office you're in, that might be difficult, right? I worked for a long time at Hewlett-Packard, right? Huge corporate monolith, and sometimes they didn't want to implement your idea because it could go wrong, or you're a nobody. If you're at a startup, it's a lot easier to say, hey, I've got a cool idea that can make us more efficient, and everyone says yes, right? So there's kind of 3 strategies to doing this. The first, obviously, is ask for permission and the time to work on this project that you think is going to help your organization. And then you can really actively collaborate with everyone in your office. If that approach doesn't work, right, or you think it's not going to be received well, then ask for permission to work on a side project, right? That's most of the time you're going to be doing your own time at lunch hour or maybe after work or something, but it still allows you to kind of increase your skills. And once you have it like halfway working, like, hey, I think this could work, then show it to a developer, and help build support for your idea that way. In our organization, we kind of did a combination of both. Right? Like I went and said, hey, the testers need to learn how to automate to my department head. And he says, well, I'm behind that. I'm going to give you time to train those people. But on the continuous integration side, it was more a team effort. Our team was like, hey, we think we could really do some cool stuff that would save all these headaches. Let's try it. So we didn't necessarily ask for permission from the department. We just said, as a team, we're willing to commit the extra time to get this implemented. And then finally, if there's total resistance or you get just an absolute no, then don't ask and just implement the proof of concept on your own time. And when you have a proof of concept, then ask your director, say, hey, at our next staff meeting or our next department meeting, like, let me present what I've done. I think people are going to be really excited about it and get buy-in that way. But I love this quote, like, if you want to achieve greatness, stop asking for permission. I think a lot of times when people get excited about an idea and then they ask for permission and they get a no, they immediately just stop there. And it's important to kind of hold on to that passion and keep trying to find an avenue. Because certainly, I think it was probably 3 or 4 months of me trying to go like, oh, hey, I think we could do this or that before people really started to adopt it. So don't give up just because you get one no. You just kind of have to keep pushing what could be possible for your organization. I rolled too far. So implementing test automation. I have this quote from Albert Einstein, try not to become a man of success, but rather try to become a man of value. And I think with test automation, like that really is the message. Anyone that I've seen have success in their organization really got people to buy in by the value that they were going to provide. To say like, hey, I think this can save us money, or it's going to cut our deployment times down by a certain amount, or something like that. So for us, regression testing was a total nightmare. I mean, weeks. And there's only one tester, so you're totally like a bottleneck, right? It's not like all the testers would swarm on a project when it was time to release. One tester would do all the testing kind of sequentially and not automated. And then scenario and role testing were the same way, right?
How many developers did you have on the team?
Probably 4 or 5.
Okay.
So if you're in a large organization, it'd be more like a product development team, just a single feature being implemented. But yeah, we would do kind of small websites. 5 people per team, 1 tester. So you can imagine 5 developers working for a month or 2 months, and then regressing on that, and then they add more features, and that same 1 tester next month has to regress on 2 months of work, and then 3 months, and then 4 months. It got pretty nasty when a product was finally fully complete. And then if you ever want to go back, maybe 6 months later to make a feature enhancement, and that tester hasn't worked on the project in 6 months, and they're switching from some other project, it was pretty bad. Yeah, not efficient.
It doesn't seem to be structured right, though. Just having one QA tester come in at the end of a cycle, because until that person is really embedded into the development.
Well, so they would be in that they're on that development team the whole time.
Okay.
But the regression was kind of the bottleneck, right? Like, yeah, okay, I've tested all the new features, but if I need to go back and make sure that, integration-wise, nothing's been broken, right? That one tester, yeah, it's not enough, right? Well, it was enough, but yeah, there was time cost to that. Then there was the problem of training non-technical QA personnel. So, you know, a lot of times if you're in a shop where it's all manual QA, maybe a person hasn't been trained. They don't have a degree in software engineering. They don't have any scripting background. And then suddenly, like, now you want me to automate. How do you get that to happen? So what I had great success with was I just sat down with the people and I said, what are the barriers that are stopping you from being able to just start learning? And number one was the IDE environment. Nobody knew how to set it up. They couldn't get even a simple test working. So we just had like a lunchtime meeting where everyone brought their computers. We got everyone's IDE set up. We put a single sample test of like, can I launch Selenium and click my home page? And got that running. And from there, people were easily, oh, okay, how do I click a button now? Or how do I put text into this field? Right? So on their own time, when they had kind of cracks of time, it was downtime for them, they could then go and learn themselves, you know, just through practice, how to start automating, right? And we had a lot of good success out of that. And then we also got our testers working as a team. So I started holding monthly meetings where we talked about, you know, like, where are you stuck, who needs help, and assigning someone to go help them. So, you know, even though I might have to spend a little bit of my time, maybe an hour or two a week, with somebody who was just learning, over time there would be a gain because then as a department we're able to automate things much quicker. And meet people where they're at. Like if someone's like, I don't even know how to code, send them to Code Academy. Teach them the basics of Java where they can, on their own time, work through some exercises and learn. Or send them to YouTube videos about Protractor or Angular or the different frameworks that we use so that they're not just flailing on their own, not sure what to do. And so you don't have to invest a lot of money into training them, right? You'll find out who's the hungry student and who just wants to kind of hang out and not be on board, right? And then you can utilize them somewhere else where manual QA is required, where it's essential, right? Put that person who doesn't want to automate on a project where you need someone looking at all those details versus somebody who can just code something up really fast. And then the final point is encourage all positive feedback. A lot of times you'll say, oh, I have this idea, and they'll be like, oh, that's really exciting, I have this idea over here. And you're like, that's not my idea. But they're excited maybe around something that's tangential to what you're doing. And I just encourage that. Like, oh, okay, I'm interested in Selenium automation, but you want to do like JMeter. Okay, go for it. Like, because that's value that's going to be added to the organization that's come out of something that you're doing. So the next time, like, you know, they're presenting, they're going to say, yeah, you know, like, Jen's been such a great partner to work with, and she's positive and encouraging. So that when someone is like, oh, I don't know if I want to get on board with this idea, now you have a champion for you, for what you're doing. And the next time someone comes to them and says, hey, I'm having problems with, you know, this, you know, regression testing, it's just too much, they'll say, go talk to Jen. She's got some great ideas that are going to help you be more efficient at what you do. So that's kind of that one. So this is an example of a slide I used in a test meeting to show value. So I had a lot of resistance from testers about, oh, I don't know, like it's too much, we can't learn to automate. And so I was doing a presentation on testing, and then I just kind of threw this slide up here. Would these things save you time? So I'm, you know, sitting in front of an audience who basically does manual regression, like day in, day out, like it can, yeah. So I said, you know, what would it be like if all of your developers' unit tests had to pass for them to deploy to the test environment? They were like, what? Like we could have that? Or, you know, what if the deployment of changes to your test environment was a single click so that you didn't have to wait for the developer to come back to lunch to say, did you deploy that? You could actually go out to Jenkins, click a button, deploy, so you know all the changes that are current, and then test what's there. They were like, I like that. Or what if you could roll back the database that you use to test to some static data set without having developer intervention? So you just went in, you totally polluted your database on a single click, bam, you're back to square one. You don't have to write tests that back out everything you did It's pristine every time. They were like, oh, we like that. So these are the types of questions that you can ask people who are resistant. Like, okay, I get that you're resistant, but is the pain you're going through now, like, are you willing to do a little bit of work to never have to have that again, right? To never have to, like, wait 2 weeks for your code to deploy, where you could click, the automated regression runs, code deploys automatically through Jenkins, and then your boss comes by and you just go like, yeah, we're done. So that's one way that you can, in any opportunity that you get to speak to a crowd, you can show value for what you're doing. And it doesn't necessarily just apply to test automation, right? You could do this with pretty much any idea that you had that involved needing the whole department.
So I have a question there.
Mm-hmm.
The previous slide, when you say regression testing was 75% automated, how do you achieve that 75% automation? Because, and is that technology agnostic? So for example, let's say someone's using Oracle Web Center based technology, and then, or sometime, let's say you're using a .NET front end with an autonomy content management based system. Both are different technology stacks.
Yeah.
How do you achieve regression testing that is automated like that?
So most of what we do in our shop is web applications, right? So you can use Selenium WebDriver, or if you're using an Angular framework, you can use Protractor, or if you're using a variety of other frameworks, there is a way to implement those, right? So with those types of frameworks, it's pretty easy to write tests really fast, so we'll click almost anything on a page, even dynamic page elements, right? Like Angular framework, there's a lot of type aheads or dynamic drop boxes, right? But with Protractor, you can do all of that. And the nice thing, too, about Protractor is there's no waits. So if you're writing in WebDriver, you're always having to manage these like expected conditions constantly. They're just a pain. They're a pain to write. With Protractor, I don't ever write a wait ever. There's no sleeps, there's no waits. Because of the promises that are built into Protractor, if you're making a request that depends on another request, it waits for that promise to return before it executes the next step. So there are a lot of advantages to using Angular or some of these other newer frameworks to do automation. Plus with Selenium 3, Appium now supports all of that, right? So if you write a script for your web application, right, it's really easy to then just put an Appium wrapper around it, use those same commands within Appium to kick off things in the browser on a tablet or in the browser on, a phone, something like that. And I heard that Sauce Labs is going to start offering testing on actual hardware devices. So you use their same interface that you would for an emulator, but that soon they're going to be offering that for actual hardware. So you don't even have to own a tablet or a phone to test on a physical tablet or phone.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then is this testing sort of browser agnostic as well?
Yeah, so you can, like here in this next point, automated regression test could be run on both your machine and multiple versions of Firefox, i.e. Chrome, Safari, whatever you want. In fact, with Sauce Labs, you can run it on like a myriad of platforms. So basically in your Protractor config or your Selenium config, you just say use this browser with these settings. So you could get window size and all kinds of stuff. So you could test specific resolutions by saying I want the window to always be set to this size. And can I still click elements? Versus if I'm going from a full screen to a tablet, and I want to see like what's the display, what's it look like. You can take screenshots, there's like a lot of crazy stuff. Sauce Labs will record a video and take screenshots at every test step. So, and those accounts are free. So if you want to go out there and sign up for a free account, you get a certain number of minutes for free where you can just play around. It's super fun.
I have a question. In my case, we test OLAP. Each release, the new build, we have a 50,000 to 60,000 test case. Sure. For a full. So we put require 4 or 5 Linux server, faster server machine run 5 days, 2 days to finish off. 5 machine run 2 days concurrently. So we each QA we responsible one OS, I responsible for Linux, some for HP. Learning regression is easy, 100% automated. The problem is He said, we run 3 release and sometimes run 1 service pack. Each week, 3 different release. Run regression is easy. The difficult part is analyze, say all that diff.
Yeah.
Then, I mean, how do you verify each small diff? Sometimes you very easily ignore because you think this is part of test issue, right? No matter how sophisticated the machine, they have networking issue, resource issue. Then very easily to ignore some small diff. Then we find out, hey, this is a server crash. This is so the trick is a bit struggling is how you analyze these small things.
Yeah. Well, not here at UC Davis, but when I worked at HP, I ran crazy number of tests across like 75 devices. I used to hack their printers, so MFPs and kind of enterprise class print devices, even the really large ones that are like 10 feet long or whatever. And I had that problem, right? That sometimes you just get a failure, and how do you know? And one of the things we implemented there was a sparkline technique. So every day you'd look at your test runs, and it would be up, a line up if it's passed, and a line down if it's failed. And you'd see like 10 days in a row or however many runs in a row in a single page view. So you could see, oh, this test has failed every day for the last week. It couldn't be an environment issue, right? It wasn't just a failed server. That actually is a real test problem. And when you're running that number of tests, that's really the only way that I've seen personally on how to know what's real and what's an anomaly, is to, in a simple graphical view, be able to see which tests are failing visually and which ones are passing. And if you see a test, some days pass, some days fail, sometimes pass, sometimes fail, then you can say, well, that's a test I need to look at and write it better so that it doesn't fail intermittently, right? I can rewrite that test. But if it's failing every day or every run, then you can, I know for sure that is a test failure. Yeah.
This Mannion has this sophisticated tool to be able to, output a deep file and easily to analyze it. Because I primarily work on console-based.
It will output a log, right? It outputs a test log, and it'll tell you which test failed, and it'll include the error message. So you can modify those and customize them to what you want. It's all driven by grunt, so all command line. So when I go in to run a test, I just enter a text command. That's how we're able to launch things through Jenkins. All right, I'm going to move on. So duplicating your success, right? It's pretty easy to get one team who's super excited to have a success and develop a proof of concept. But then how do you get that proof of concept kind of rolled out into your organization? I didn't actually write this slide. A guy that was our developer who was supposed to come, he actually couldn't come today, but he wrote this slide. And for him, it was really nailing down your environment, your production environment, your test environment, your development environment, so that those servers are identical. So that you could say, hey, if it runs on test, I know it's going to run on dev and production because the hardware there is identical. Then we're not going to have some weird system anomalies because they're all configured the same, right? So you could rule out a lot of those, oh, it was the machine or network issue, by saying like these machines are essentially identical. And that basically very minimal environment configuration, right? You're basically dropping the WAR file in, and it's going to deploy your application. And then if you build it, you deploy it. So none of this like, oh, I wrote the code, now somebody over there is going to handle it for me. Like, we're not quite there, but we want to be to the point where if I want to run your code, I download it, Tomcat 7 run, it works. Not like, oh, I got to do this and this special step and some magic over here, right? Literally, like, anybody can get the code in the department, download it to their machine, Tomcat 7 run, and it runs, right? That's standardized. And, depending on where you work, maybe there's buy-in, maybe there isn't. But most of the people that I've seen have success with any kind of continuous integration or test automation, they just hold the line. Like, this is what we do here, right? If you're not interested in writing clean, quickly deployable code, maybe this isn't the right place for you, right? Like, I'm sure at Etsy, they're not going to tell you, like, it's cool to just hack some stuff together. They're not going to say that, right? They're going to say, no, like, we deploy thousands of times a day. Like, when you deploy, it better work. And then how to get other teams to adopt a proof of concept. So I was on a team that created the proof of concept, and now I'm on the team that ended up adopting it. So I kind of have this interesting perspective of being able to see how that transition happened. And really, it comes down to bringing kind of your firsthand experience to the team. So when this team said, hey, we like your proof of concept, it's not like we just handed them a pile of documentation and said, good luck. Our team actually engaged with them. We did code walkthroughs. I went and met with them because they didn't have a QA at the time who could automate, and said, hey, if you guys want to do what we're doing, you have to be willing as developers to take on this automation because your QA is not ready. Like, we'll train your QA, but your QA isn't ready, so you have to be ready to take responsibility for that. And they were like, yeah, we're willing. We want the improvements. And that team actually can deploy in less than a day now. From, I don't know what it was before. Do you know, Mike, the initial bio deployments?
Oh, yeah, those were months and months.
Yeah, so month-long deployment down to 1 day. That's the kind of improvement we're talking about from people who didn't know what they were doing when they started the transition. Like, we've never done continuous integration, but we're willing because it's so painful the other way.
I did get a statistic from switching to Agile from what it was with that project's initial deployment and regression testing time. We took it down from, I think, 10 days to 2.
Yeah.
So
So just at the initial phase, that much of an improvement, and now we're down to, yeah, probably less than an hour to deploy that application. And it's by no means fully continuously integrated. That's kind of like, it's a legacy project that we can't seem to get off our plate, right?
So is this HP?
No. I work now for the University of California.
Oh, okay.
So,
Even HP has very good system of integration.
yeah, now they do. Well, at least the department that I was working for, they got their deployment times down pretty fast. Where like they had multiple check-ins per day, and before you checked in, you had to do a series of steps, and very much kind of the continuous integration, very like Lean Six Sigma. Okay, so this is Mike's. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how this works. I think I got it. Okay, so where are we at? Okay, so I'm more of a Scrum Master / business analyst within the department. Periodically, I'll touch the code, but I try not to because I don't want to break things that people like Jen know how to work with. So what you're going to hear from me is a lot of stuff discussing essentially what kind of happened from my perspective, observing other people implement it and how I was able to assist them in that process. So Jen's already covered this a little bit when she was just talking about the team, but one of the things that's important to know, especially when you're evangelizing Agile and Agile practices and extreme programming practices, is you need to know how to distribute that Kool-Aid out amongst the department. One of the things that was really evident was that it has to happen at the team level. And it has to be a commitment that actually comes from the team. And along with that is not just the investment at the team level for evangelizing Agile and continuous integration practices, but it's also informing your product owner because it is going to be a huge time sink up front. From before my team started actually adopting continuous integration practices, it took us 3 individual efforts to work through just to get automated testing going. Because it was a time sink for the team to invest in learning that. We really fully operated as a team. So because of that, it took time away from development, it took time away from manual QA, and it also took time away from other business analysis practices like backlog grooming and things like that we were doing. So we attempted it not once, not twice, but 3 times before automated testing really stuck with the team. And that's something that you really need to insulate your team from around the department because, from a lot of the managerial types or the higher ups, they might not understand that you're going through that learning practice. So we had to make sure that our product owner was on board because they represent the business side that we're developing the product for. And fortunately for us, we had one that was on board with making sure that things were going faster, but we definitely had to educate them in that process. After we got it working on the team level, that's when it came up from the team level and started going into the Center of Excellence and Improvement community. Some of those groups that Jen was just talking about, she took those practices and those proof of concepts to them and said, these are things that we're actually doing right now. Would you like to join us in this initiative because it's going to make things a lot better? And I was actually in that meeting where she presented the slide she was just talking about. And so that was something that really got people going. But we had to show them that it was already going on, that it was possible, because it wasn't happening elsewhere yet. After that, we started with multi-team initiatives. And as our systems become more integrated in our department, this is becoming ever more important. So once the need was established and we could prove that it was working, we started working with multiple teams on these initiatives, and then now it's headed up to the organization level because, as I said, our systems are becoming more integrated and we need continuous integration occurring across the department and across all projects. So, as I was saying, the team attempted it 3 times before we really got it to stick. As far as continuous integration practices. And because we were a Scrum team, we operate within work cycles called sprints. So we were planning for those at the release level. Because when we tried it at the sprint level, we would write goals for automated testing. We would write user stories for automated testing, what we wanted to do, just trying different methods to get it to work. But eventually, we just had to plan for it at the release level when we're working across multiple sprints and say, we want this release to go well, so we need to have all of these automated testing practices occurring during all of our individual sprints. So we had to plan for it, plan our capacity in to learn that, and then make it work all the way through. As I said, the entire team had to be committed to and focused on the scope of the release. That meant we had to be really disciplined in our Scrum practices. We couldn't operate on requirements outside of the sprint. We couldn't just take best guesses at what we thought people would want. So we had to be really disciplined with our product owners and really disciplined as a team to stick to that scope because we needed to test for everything we were developing, and that meant extra time had to go into that. So, and sure.
For the automation for the current sprint, was story automation for the current story, or?
Well, because we were new to automation, we weren't quite sure how to work it in. So we tried a few different things. We tried writing stories that would say, we are going to automate 30% of our code coverage for this sprint. And we would say, that'll be worth, 8 story points.
Okay, so this automation effort was like made a story, not the story automated, right?
Right. So in the end, what actually ended up happening is we worked it into our definition of done. Oh. And so then it was just covering every story that we developed. But, we were new to the practice and we were just trying to figure it out. And so eventually it took a couple different stabs before we got that one option to stick. Also, one of the things that we're running into now that we're starting to move more towards Git as a code repository, especially now it's even more important. Our team just recently adopted that and we're using Git flow, I think, as our process model. So divergences could break master and limit our ability to release, so we have to be really careful about that. And we've actually worked that testing scope into our pull requests. So in order to get it to pass, you also have to have the tests along with it.
So, question,
Sure.
any reason for moving towards Git? Like, what were you previously on?
We were using SVN.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the main reason for moving to Git is with the Angular project, we're using a lot of open source libraries. So in Grunt, or the way that we build the code, it's much easier if we're on Git to just pull in other Git libraries, right, and within that build cycle. Whereas with SVN, right, we had to download our code base and then somehow download these other libraries and then all the code in one place and then build it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's faster and
Yeah.
distributed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're working on the cloud,
Mm-hmm.
you can't connect to your subversion server, you can still do engines.
The other side benefit, especially for me as a business analyst and Scrum Master, is that Bitbucket can be fully integrated with Jira and Confluence. which were both tools that we were already using. So it just seemed like a natural extension of that to move toward another Atlassian product.
Because we were using Mercurial and SVM.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was just wondering, that what was the reason to move to Git?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why we didn't choose. We had originally considered Mercurial and Git, which one do we want to pick, and we went with Git just because it's what everything, all the other libraries we're using, we could just pull.
Okay.
Also, just a quick question on your Agile sprint cycle. How long was your sprint cycle? Was it the standard 2-week sprint? Or
First, we did 1-week sprints. And by the time we were starting to try automated testing, we had moved to 2-week sprints. And then after that, we determined we needed more research time. So we actually did kind of a modified 2-week sprint where we would do 9 days on, 1 day research. So that we would actually make sure our developers and testers were building in time to do that additional research for new practices. And that one we found to be pretty successful. My current team is actually back to 1-week sprints.
So when you say research, testing for planning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's essentially, like the 10% or 20% research time. We wanted to make sure that we were building that into our work cycle so it would actually get done. Because when we would write like a user story or something to make sure we were allocating some level of effort to it, a lot of times those would be the things that would slip to the bottom. So eventually I said, we'll just schedule it in.
It worked really well too, because a lot of times up front, the QA may not have a lot of work at the very beginning of a sprint. You could write a page model, you could do a few things, but until features were delivered, you couldn't necessarily automate them. So a lot of times I would use the first day of the sprint as my research and development time into new techniques that we could be using. Then I would move to automation, and then by the time I was through all of that, there would be code or some smaller story that I could start testing and automating. And then at the tail end, the developers would have this day to kind of study and research when they were complete with their code, which would allow me time to kick off any regression tests or do any last minute stuff that required that final feature that they were completing the day before.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Especially in our case, for example, we weren't very good at automation.
Mm-hmm.
We had outsourced it to HCL.
Mm-hmm.
And we just weren't able to automate our testing. And so what it meant was we used to have these 2-week development cycles followed by a 1 week of regression testing
Mm-hmm.
and fixes. So it used to become a 3-week cycle. So it's great to know that you achieved 75%.
Yeah, you really need to invest the time in getting there though.
Yeah. But it's worth it in the end.
Mm-hmm. So.
Did you work the 3-week sprint or 2-week sprint?
Totally 3 weeks, because it was like 2 weeks of development, 1 week of testing, and then business acceptance.
User acceptance testing, yeah.
All of it, yes. It became a 3-week cycle for us.
Mm-hmm.
Just because of the overhead of not being able to do regression testing.
Yeah, so it's like a mini waterfall in that time box, right?
So one thing I tried was to lag automation by 1 sprint. So normally we identify the functionalities,
Mm-hmm.
and the automation team is sort of shared. We don't give complete. They're not. They're supporting multiple teams. So what we do is, once we identify the regression test cases, the user stories will be identified for the next iteration. It worked well, but towards the end, we always have those buffer sprint where we make the fine tuning.
Yeah, I'm familiar with those very much. I think it would be nice to say that everything would go smoothly, and after 1 sprint, everything would be cleaned up. But there's always additional work that needs to be done. So one of the things that's been interesting to see, though, is that now that we've kind of gotten automated testing and unit testing specifically as integral parts of our processes, we're now able to release early and often. This last week, I think we developed something within an hour and released it because we wanted to make sure that we were fixing a bug for folks. And so when you do those early and often in smaller releases, it's minimal risk and hassle. And the minimal risk is the most important part, because once your team gets into the habit of deploying every few hours or every day, the size of the change is substantially smaller, so it's much safer to do. So for product owners, you want to educate them about the time and effort you're going to be putting into continuous integration early. Now, whenever I do an onboarding process with a product owner, I just let them know up front that this is a standard practice that my team takes on. It's because we want to make sure that we're committed to quality and speed, and it's going to pay off in the end. That's all you have to tell them.
So you said you're preparing the product owner that there is some other things to be done in the backlog, or are you saying the estimate is going to be high? What are they preparing him?
I just let them know that periodically we're going to be paying down technical debt, and we're going to be doing that by focusing our efforts on testing and making sure our code is clean, and that's just a standard practice for the team. So that's why I stress the benefits. I let them know that, you know, as the team embarks on these experiments, this is only to improve our process, so we're going to have faster product delivery in the end. We're reducing our risk overall, and that means, you know, there's less crashes to a system that they're invested in, and also that we're going to have lower technical debt, so we don't have to spend those 2 weeks at the end of our development periods doing regression testing. One of the things, though, with the lower technical debt is that we also have to make sure that they understand that and what that comes down to. It's not always just a testing thing. Sometimes that might mean we have incomplete requirements that we've been building around and we're not capturing all the fields that they need within a system. So,
and you have to tell, I mean, you have to tell them the impact that it has on deliverables, or, you know, how that's going to impact the
yeah, I say if you want to
timeline and stuff.
yeah, so if when they're writing acceptance criteria, I mean, we strive to be agile, but I found that release planning is really the nice balance between the two of waterfall and agile. So you can plan for a release. That doesn't take, you know, an exorbitant amount of time. And with that release, if they want to report at the end of it, you know, that might be something that we have to plan for earlier on if they want their, you know, folks capturing that data along the way. So we just kind of work with them to make sure that we're getting all of that.
Yeah, and I've seen Mike use this technique quite a few times where we're in a meeting, we're trying to get them to be solid on an acceptance criteria, and they say, well, I just don't really know that right now, and I'm going to have to go out to a work group that's meeting a week from now and ask that question. It's going to be a while before you can get that information back. And he'll come back to them and say, hey, this right here is going to be technical debt. So we're okay with designing with kind of this unknown, but in a certain time frame, we need an answer from you, and it's going to be an additional story that we're tacking on somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So don't think that your delay is really free. There's a cost to that, and we're notifying you now that there'll be a cost, so that later when we say we need to handle this, they won't say, well, you already did that story.
Yeah. And that's a good point, because it's not just a one-time education, right? It's every time we do backlog grooming, which is once a week. So, or when we're doing release planning, which could be a second meeting. So it's important to keep up with that, because they'll learn it. You know, by the second project they're working on with you, they'll be really familiar with that practice.
So, question for the release planning: do you have some percentage for technical debt from the backlog, or how do you plan the schedule?
Oh.
Or do you have some? What tricks did you do to
how do I?
The technical debt, like.
Oh, so we really focus on it.
Understand my question?
Yeah, I think so. What techniques do we use to manage technical debt?
Yeah, because it's like you have a backlog, right? So there is a schedule, right? If
Yeah.
the schedule plan entirely, if it's entirely the backlog, do you have a percentage for technical debt?
We have.
So that the schedule is still taking care of it. Otherwise, the schedule is going to skip, right?
Right. So, well, and that might be we extend the release.
Okay.
So we update our release plan after every sprint, so if we find that maybe we missed something along the way, we might have to add another story to the end of it, like Jen was saying, to make sure we're covering that. So kind of the equation that I use for it is story points times, you know, velocity divided by sprints. I can't remember. There's an equation I use to kind of map out how many weeks it's going to take to actually get a release out, and we normally do it scope-based versus time-based or funding-based, because we're a, you know, public institution. So our scheduling works a little bit different.
You're lucky, actually.
But you know, we let them know that there are other projects in the backlog that we need to get to, and so there is going to be a limit to the time we can work on things.
And in a corporate environment, you could really manage that with, you know that the code's probably going to take about this amount of time, and there's always that buffer. So if you plan your release with a certain amount of buffer at the end, and every time you tell them this end date, and every time that you get into your buffer, you're giving kind of this notification like this may extend your release. Like so far we think we can handle it, but maybe you're getting close to having to extend your release, then they might think twice about not making that decision. If you say, I think this might extend your release by a week, I can't be sure, but I think it might, they might say, well, I can get back to you tomorrow about that, versus putting you off.
Yeah, thank you. So also maintaining transparency. You want your product owners to feel like an integral part of the team because they are an integral part of the team. They're one of the most important parts of the team. So in order to make sure you're maintaining that relationship and also getting their acceptance to spend time on things like this, you want to be transparent with them and let them know what it is you're allocating your efforts toward. So for team collaboration, one of the things that's been really exciting to see as teams adopt continuous integration practices is how they can all swarm this task together. And part of what goes into that is evaluating emergent processes. Jen was talking about a lot of the software tools our department is currently using to automate their practices. That's not something that just one person did. We had numerous people out there researching Karma and Protractor, JUnit, all the various testing tools that we use. So that wasn't just one person, that was multiple people evaluating that, from developers to QAs to business analysts looking into it. The team also, like I said, had to revamp their definition of done, so it was no longer just tests pass. It was, we have to have X amount of coverage. It was, it has to be, the QA is able to run those tests and not just the developer. So we had to make sure that everybody was on board with that, and that was committing to a definition of done that we were going to check each story against before we released it. And also shared ownership. So the team, succeeds and fails together, so we needed to make sure that everybody was on board with that. And so when we picked up automated testing, it wasn't one person, even I was automated testing. Also, as I was mentioning before, we tried it on 3 separate occasions before we finally got one practice to stick. So you need to be prepared for failures and to make sure that the team is aware that that's a normal process of the learning cycle, because they'll be pretty bummed out if they fail a sprint and none of their tests are passing. And you also have to make sure you're celebrating the successes, because everybody deserves a pat on the back when their test runs.
Michael, I have a question.
Sure.
Now when you're talking about these sprint cycles, are these operational in nature or are these project-based in nature? So are these like fixes that are just regularly going in to a existing production system, or is this like a new project that's being released?
Initially, it started out as just project. But one of the things that ended up happening once we started to adopt release planning is teams started to get their products out faster and faster so that we could get early adopters and apply some more lean methods to our cycles. So in doing that, we kind of left the just project cycles for in-development projects and started to make it for in-production projects. So they were still being actively developed, new features were being added all the time, but they were out there and they were live and people were using them.
And then how often did you actually release to production? Because this continuous integration, I think I can understand until it goes into, let's say, development, QAs, UAT or staging. But did you have something like a fixed cycle when it actually released to production?
We started out with the 2-week cycles because that's what the teams were comfortable with, because that was the sprint cycle. And we wanted to make sure they were confident in their code before it was getting pushed. Now, though, that the teams are much more mature in their practices and they're getting more confident in their code, and they're making sure that, like I was talking about for the pull requests, that they have to have the tests written before they could actually get approved and pushed to master. Now they get really confident, and so we're starting to see releases more frequently. I think Jen's current team has been doing almost daily releases occasionally. So
Yeah. So at one point when they were kind of in the end stages of development, yeah, every day they would just push the latest features on this. So yeah, so basically some teams on certain projects that have full continuous integration implemented, they could push every day if they wanted. Certainly every day to test. So.
And are these new features or are these fixes going in? Because
new features.
New features.
New features. Where it's like, I did my feature, it's automated, kick it to test, run the regression, push it out to production.
Now, are these for end users? Like let's say, is this for students of UC Davis?
Right.
And so how do people come to know that new features are being made available, what's coming in, or like how do you even train people in your support organization what's going out?
So I know on the team that I just joined, they have kind of administrators, so we will roll out a new feature list. So when we deploy to production, they receive an email. They said the deployment to production is going to happen at this time, like 5 p.m. from 5 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. We're deploying to production. These new features will be available. A lot of times they've been part of that process, so they know kind of what these new features entail. Or if we're rolling out like a quick bug fix, we'll just say bug fixes are being deployed at this time. And then, yeah, we just roll it out. And for individual users, they'll eventually, it kind of will trickle down, right? Somebody in their department will say, I need this new form or something. And they say, well, how do I do that? Oh, it's a new feature in the system. And so we don't really do any of that communication. We just kind of communicate to the people who are the owners of the system, kind of the product owner. And then they externally communicate to their customers who are using that system. You know, for some systems, there might be a user guide that we create internally, or we might create training videos internally, depending on how complicated the software is to use. But the focus is really to design it so that you don't need instructions. So we have a whole new front-end team, the team that Mike's on, where it's their goal, department-wide, to train developers to make systems intuitive, to where someone could just sit down and go, oh yeah, this makes sense. Not like, I need to read a whole manual for 2 days before I even know how to use this.
And does it go through multiple environments like dev, QA, stage?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the developers have a development environment that they pull down their individual IDE, and then they push that out to the dev server to test their changes, and then that'll eventually get pushed to staging. If regression goes well, there's a test server, and then it'll eventually get pushed out to production. And I have a whole workflow slide I can show you, just kind of show you every step in that process.
One of the things that's been really interesting to see from my perspective, though, with the continuous integration is that as more and more folks are actually getting familiar with IDEs and their own environments, is less and less work seems to be done on dev, and more work is being done on individual development environments. And so that's exciting to see that comfort level is getting up there just within the entire organization. So team splitting. So one of the things that we've encountered is, projects end, teams move on, and what happens, especially when you're in a proof of concept team that's really been working to get those technical practices up and common, is when this happens, it can be a bit disparaging because new teams will form and they start moving, and maybe they're not moving at the same clip as they used to be. So one of the things that I think is important to do is to make sure that you're minimizing expectations for your team, and also that the team is aware that this is, again, another facet of the natural learning process. So even though some teams might be really mature, when you have a new group of people getting together, even if they've been doing Scrum and continuous integration in their own way, each team might have a slightly different practice that they're doing. It takes a little while for things to start gelling and that familiarity to really take hold. So I think it's important to make sure you're taking adequate time for a process reset. It's also a good time to evaluate new emergent methods of doing continuous integration. And then once you take that time for a process reset and really look at what you're doing and get everybody on board with a new practice to move forward with, then you can start working toward that continuous integration again. But again, I think the most important thing is to strive toward confident code first. So at the end of the day, I think it's important to just keep continuing to evangelize Agile and make sure that everybody is aware that your practices are really cycles of work like an experiment. So each time you might run it through, it could succeed or fail, but you're going to get some sort of result, and hopefully you're going to learn from it. Then after that, you want to make sure that you're continuing to encourage your team to be the proof of concept for those best practices across your organization.
Are your teams co-located?
Yes.
So it's not like you have any offshore component solved?
No, one of our teams has offshore members, but my entire team, I have the good fortune of having all of them sitting within 5 feet of me. We call it the constant conversation because it really doesn't stop, but that's important for team synchronicity.
Yeah. I've seen at HP we use a lot of outsourced in India, and I've seen kind of this approach work there, but you do have some communication delay. So that's really the hardest part is that, you know, if everything goes according to plan, then you sure push the release, click the button, anybody can do it, whether they're sitting in India or they're sitting here, right? And that's the awesome part. But the downside is if there is a failure, you know, you have to account for that time. If the failure is found in India, then the communication back and forth to get the fix on the very next day, right? So if that communication isn't strong, you might wait 24 hours, 48 hours, or longer for a fix. So in security vulnerability, a lot of times we were holding that release of printer software, firmware out into like the public, right? So 24 hours could be very costly if they're trying to start the printer manufacturing run with that firmware. So, you know, depending on your environment, you know, just knowing if there is a failure, we need a process in place for service level agreements for how fast that communication is going to happen and how testers on either end can swarm around that problem to get it fixed immediately so you aren't dealing with that kind of a cost.
I have a question for the continuously integrated. How often was the build generated? Was it a build check-in, build was generated, or what was the
Yeah,
method?
build on every check-in. If the build fails, the developer who made the wrong check-in receives an email. I can actually show that. I have a
So
slide.
I have a related question again. So now, did the QA complain that I'm getting like more builds? I'm not able to test all the builds, or did they say like, oh, we just need like once a day build or a nightly build? Because I'm getting like
Most of the QAs are eager to get the latest
no, so
build.
let's assume like each like we have 10 developers. Okay, 10 developers taking a build, so there's 10 builds, right? You're in this approach, what you mentioned, every check-in is a build. So it's a 10 build, and I'm a QA. I'm just one person.
Yeah, so
So should I test all the 10 builds, or should I test the first build and I have a bug? Which bug should I report? Should I report the bug on 9th build or the second build? And it's coming randomly.
So that's where that's where having the different servers comes in, right? So like he was saying, there's a dev environment, a stage environment. So, you know, whenever as a tester, I'm ready to test some new features, I can go onto our Jenkins server, click deploy. Any features that have been built, deploy then to my test server, right? And against that test server, I'll execute, you know, whatever tests I need to execute. Now, if a feature's not done and I've written tests for it already, those tests will just fail until that feature's complete, right? So I don't even have to ask someone, are you done with your feature? I'll look. If all the tests are failing, probably you're not done. If some of them are passing, then I might ask, did you finish it or you still have work remaining? If there's still work remaining, that's probably why the tests are failing. But if they say I'm done and their test didn't pass, then I know, okay, they're not done. They need to fix that.
Let's assume the test pass. Okay, all the builds test pass. So in that scenario, how did the QA handle it?
Well, if they know all the features are done, all the tests pass, there might be some manual tests they have to run that can't be automated, right? So they would run those, and if it's done, and everyone says it's done, then that's a pass. You just click another button and deploy it. You know, or you might wait for, you know, your users to look at it or your product owner to look at it, and if they give the thumbs up, then yeah, deploy it. Full confidence, which is pretty awesome.
So one thing what we did was we made sure that the tests are running. That is the unit test.
Mm-hmm.
The first criteria is whether the build is working fine.
Right, build in and
And
crash.
then we stack up 10 to 15, like what you were saying. We don't put it straight to the QA or the next environment. We stack up and say at the end of the day, then we push all of them at one stop and say when they push it to the next one, they need to definitely give a note. This code all changed and this is the functionality, the QA will see a difference.
But is stacking, is it automated or is it a computer? So it's not continuous.
You can stack that kind of thing. Like they definitely had that at HP where every developer would check in the code, right? And you'd have several builds at the end of the night.
Every nightly build or like every few hours, right?
Right, but on every check-in, they would run what they call a pillar of tests. So on every check-in, they run a minimal set of tests that maybe take, 10 minutes, right? And then the developer has to watch and see, did my test pass? If not, it'll get kicked back. And then they get a notification, you broke something, you better fix it. And then the next person would check in, right, with their changes. If those previous changes were already checked in, then they would get both. The next build would get both. But if this person's build failed, it wouldn't check those in. It would just go directly to the next person and run those minimal set of tests. And then at the end of the day or after half a day, then a larger set of tests would run. And overnight, then they would run an even larger set of tests that's more complete. So, if you're dealing with a product that isn't kind of smaller and new, right, you're dealing with a kind of megalith product that has 80 million features and it's been in production for like 4 years, right, and you kind of just do these new features ongoingly, right, then you're going to need that kind of a automation framework, right, where you're doing a small set of tests on the new features and then integration, larger set of tests on integration, and then finally a full regression run that you run every night or once a week or whatever intervals required for your team. But, we're kind of more smaller shop, right? We don't have software yet that has been in production for over 5 years or something like that. So we aren't dealing with it yet, but certainly when I have discussions with testers, I ask them questions like, if your team gets to the point where they're deploying changes every day, how are you as a tester going to handle that? That's one of the ways that I got them to develop automated regression, because they're like, oh, if they're deploying every day, like there's no way we could handle that.
Yeah, that's what I asked. Like, I QA members who said the same thing. So.
Yeah, so it's by presenting them with, here's the problem you have now. If things continue the way they're going, 5 years from now, when your team has maybe written 4 or 5 different code bases, and you are maintaining all of those, what's it going to look like? How much are you paying? How many people do you need to hire? All of that versus automate it now. Spend that time now to automate or to get continuous integration going, and you never have that exponential growth of testing, right? It stays linear the whole time through because you're paying kind of that cost up front, but it's saving you a ton of money and a ton of time in the long run. So this is kind of a picture of sort of the automated deployment process. The orange areas are maybe things that different teams haven't mastered. Green is where we definitely have a standardized process in place. And it kind of goes through the whole thing. You can do this for your organization and say, how do teams deploy, right? Like the code gets checked in, then what happens? Does Jenkins build it, or how is it built? Does the developer build it on their own system? If the build's successful, what happens? And you can create a whole chart like this and identify where in my organization is the roadblock. We're halfway there, or we're a third of the way there. Some things are working, some things aren't. This will help you to identify where's the problem and who in this organization is excited about fixing it, right? And then just assign a group of people like, hey, work on this. With the 2 teams that we have now that are kind of the forefront of this, Mike's team and my team, we have different areas that we're great at. Like my team can deploy at will. They're like, yeah, let's do it. They didn't even have a QA for the last 6 months. All developers doing all their own testing, automated and everything. Whereas Mike's team, they're really good at continuous integration, all these nice features where you get emails and it's all triggered, right? No manual intervention. So it's now we're working on getting these 2 teams to talk. And what are the best practices from each? Let's create a process that's really solid. And then let's roll that out to everybody else who's kind of still struggling.
Do you folks use Chef or Puppet in any way as well?
Do we use what?
Chef or Puppet?
We don't use those yet. I've seen a little bit about them, but yeah, we haven't kind of ventured into that realm yet. Mostly right now we're using Angular or Selenium WebDriver. So Protractor or WebDriver. We're learning Appium. We use Grunt and Bower. We use those quite a bit. And then Jenkins for deployment. But depending on what your tool chain is, right? Some of those other things might be useful. You might use a Selenium grid. You might choose Sauce Labs. There's a lot of different ways you can go.
Just because you also mentioned that you are able to deploy to production on a regular basis, how often do you conduct vulnerability scanning against a production site?
Right now, we only do it quarterly. That's a requirement. So anytime that we push to production a release, then we would run it. If it's in kind of maintenance mode and we're just doing bug fixes, then the requirement is quarterly, so every 3 months. But like I said, we're smaller shop, right? So if it's enterprise code or people's credit card numbers or more of those types of things where you are very, very concerned about security, then obviously you're probably going to want to scan more frequently.
How do you handle performance as well, by the way?
JMeter is what we've been using. In fact, there's an email that just went out on like the JMeter meetup list or something where they're, for startups, they're offering free use for the next 6 months. So if you need the link to that, you can definitely email me and I'll forward it to you because that's pretty awesome. Basically, you say, I'm a startup and I'm willing to say you're awesome if this works for me and give you a promotion like, hey, use it, it's awesome. First, and they were charging, I don't know what the price they were charging, but it was a significant amount, like $2,000 a month or something. Now they're offering it for free because they want publicity. And that's in the cloud, JMeter in the cloud.
Did your team automate JMeter test also?
We haven't really started to focus on that. Like right now, we just switched from, okay, we got continuous integration going, now let's move to security. So looking at, how do we have a standardized policy across the organization? How do we launch security scans from Grunt or from Jenkins as part of the build? So if we were going to do a production release, we could, basically automate that process so that what we get spit back is just, I found vulnerabilities or I didn't, right? That type of thing. So.
What kind of monitoring tools do you use?
Like for code coverage or
No, not for code.
live applications?
Live applications.
Yeah, that we don't really handle the ops side. So we just got an ops team in place, and so I'm not sure what they're using, but I know that.
Splunk or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what they use, but I'm sure they have like some kind of dashboard. And maybe as things progress more, they'll pull the development teams more into that or be willing to show us their dashboard. But right now, not yet.
I know that's currently making a more robust suite of monitoring tools is on their initiative, so we'll probably have more information on that in the near future.
Yeah, but so far, we haven't implemented anything.
So are these projects like mainly using Davis websites or is it like?
Yeah, they're campus-wide. So some of our projects are all of the UC system, right? Full campus adoption, right? So usually we have a campus who says, I need a tool. Can you develop it for me? We're willing to pay money. We develop the tool, and then once we have kind of something, or we have initial requirements, we might go out to all the other campuses and say, so-and-so's requested this tool, but we want to see, is it something that you'd be interested in using if we create it, and get requirements from them too. And then once you kind of have the full picture, what does this look like across all campuses, then kind of implementing that and using the initial user, right, as your kind of proof of concept, and once they've said, yeah, we like this, then you can go out and demo that to other campuses.